Hello and welcome to our second colloquium of the semester for our first year students in words and numbers. My name is Tamily Weissman and I am an associate professor in the biology department here at Lewis and Clark, and I'm also the co-chair of the neuroscience program. And I run a research program that focuses on visualizing how the brain grows and functions. And I am here to sort of encourage a discussion among a bunch of awesome peers who have joined us today. I'd like to thank Kundai Chirindo and Don Wilson for all of the work that they are doing for this program. And I'd like to especially thank all of the faculty who are teaching in words and numbers this semester. And I'd like to thank the students for showing up and listening to this conversation today. So let me take a moment and introduce who we'll be hearing from. We'll start with Greta Binford. Wave, Greta. And Greta is a professor in the biology department. She's an evolutionary biologist whose work focuses on the diversity of spiders and their venoms. And she's interested in understanding how evolution generated the diversity of life. She's currently teaching a numbers section that is centered on data. Brian House. Wave, Brian. Is an assistant professor in the art department, and he is an artist whose work engages with science and technology from geolocation tracking to urban ecology. Thank you for being here, Brian and Greta. Jay Odenbaugh, a professor in the philosophy department, and he is a philosopher of science whose work focuses on issues in biology and psychology. Currently, he's writing a book on emotions. What are they? How did they evolve? And why are they important for ethics and the arts? This is a group of really interesting and diverse individuals academically. And finally, I'd like to introduce Ellen Selgen, an associate professor in the political science department. Ellen is a political scientist whose work focuses on policy analysis at the state and local levels of government. Her most recent work is on the effect of automatic voter registration on voter turnout. I imagine she has a lot to say around about now. So in this discussion, we'd like to focus on where science is today. We have all read an article in the New Yorker by author Joshua Rothman, and the name of that article is "How Does Science Really Work?" We are in a world somehow where our current president now has used the term scientist as a direct insult of another candidate. And so this really questions where we have come as a society in terms of our trust and value of scientists. In his article, Joshua Rothman talks quite a bit about how science has evolved over the centuries. Early on, so he contrasts modern science, which would be like the last 400 years, with science before that period of time, pre-modern science, if you will. And initially, scientists took on a very holistic, interdisciplinary approach. So scientists like Descartes and Galileo would talk about how some scientific question in the context of the heavens and astronomy and the mind, and thinking about how all of the pieces of the world fit together. And over time, this large view of science has become progressively more narrow. Modern science, Rothman says, follows something called an iron rule, which is a rule that scientists must focus on a very narrow question and collect very detailed and specific empirical data in order to answer smaller questions without concern about all those larger fields. One quote from the article is, "Science is objective, scientists are not. Can an iron rule explain how they've changed the world anyway?" So there is a lot to discuss about this article, and we won't have time to touch on more than a few items. but I'd like to start the conversation by thinking about images and visualization of scientific data. So as we've all seen over the past 6 months and beyond, graphs, visual images representing information, for example, throughout the COVID epidemic, can be particularly influential for a quick snapshot of understanding something scientifically. And scientists themselves, when they're reading scientific articles, are looking for those graphs to understand what the authors are really trying to say. So I wanted to start by asking several of you to talk about graphs and the visualization of data and how important that is in scientific work and in communication about science with the public. And so Jay Odenbaugh, I wonder if you could start by talking about your thoughts on this.
Sure. Thanks, Tamily, for doing this, and thanks you guys for conversation. You know, several years ago, I was teaching a class, and I was talking to another professor at LC, and we were talking about how scientists read their papers versus how humanists read their papers. And one of the things that really struck me was, this is what I've been told at least, scientists read the intro, the conclusion, they pay careful attention to the method section, and then they immediately spend their time looking at the graphs in particular. And that's radically different than the way humanists read papers. We read front to back, scour over words. And it suggested that the graphs, the visual information actually is the most important part of a scientific paper. And it really struck me is that there's something really deep and important about the way that information is displayed. It's encoded, and I'm just kind of curious what we all think about that. Is that true? Is that the way scientists read their papers, both social and natural? And then what we make of the fact that if that's true, like that's what we're doing.
So could I ask Greta and Ellen to comment on that from your own perspectives in science?
Sure. So I'll just echo Jay's thank you for organizing this. I'm excited about the conversation. As a scientist, yes, I do often look straight at the figures first, and I mean, read the abstract, read the title, read the end of the introduction to find out what they're really doing, and then and look at the figures. And in many fields, including mine, I mean, I think that the challenge with data is we're trying to distill complexity into units that we can actually make sense of, right? And then we analyze them, we put them together into a context where we can extract information from them. So a figure that's well made is the distillation of all that with the punchline, right? And I think the most effective communication for, among scientists and from scientists to beyond are those that are simplified, that emphasize the main impact of those analyses and those results. So yeah, I think data visualization, especially in this world where we're buried in mounds of data, can really magnify the impact of what we can extract to make sense of this world.
So I am a quantitative political scientist, and I would say that I absolutely read papers exactly as you described, Jay. The figures are immensely powerful because they show kind of the effect size in a real magnitude that you don't get at by looking at a decimal in a table or reading that. And the way that social scientists and natural scientists do these data visualizations is you have the confidence intervals right there so that you can see them and you can see what is significant and what is not. And it really is this great snapshot into a paper. But I think the most important thing is what you said about really scrutinizing the methods, because you can't open a paper, look at a graph and understand it, because you don't know what data is going in, and that makes all the difference. You can lie with a graph just as easily as you can lie with any statistic. It all comes into kind of the quality of the work and the research design that is underpinned. So I love a graph, but I love that method section a little bit more. And I do think it is interesting to think about how, when you open the New York Times today, you're kind of front and center with a data visualization, but you don't have that method section. So I wonder, like, yes, it is a great way to see things, but is there a danger in kind of trusting these visualizations without having that methodology with you?
Brian, from an artist's perspective, who I know has thought a lot about visualization and collaborating art and science, do you have comments on this? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is great. And thank you for including me in the discussion. This is really fun. I'd like to go back, I guess, to, well, Greta used the key phrase here for me, which is like make sense, right? And my take on science is that it's actually art, right? But just doesn't always want to admit it. Because it's always dealing with those things that we can't perceive directly and finding how to interpret those things, right? So whether you're talking about the composition of distant stars or subatomic particles or X-rays or epidemiological trends, you know, these are things that are not immediately sensory, and you know, but with the use of methods and tools and everything else, like you're finding a way to make them address the body as something that we can perceive and have intuition about it. And you know, that exercise, I mean, if I look at a visualization of massive amounts of data, that's going to trigger a very different part of my brain, you know, than if I'm using a microscope or if I'm doing like a naturalist's drawing. Um, the mode of observation, you know, will trigger a different kind of set of intuition and insight and drive further questions and whatever else. So there's really aesthetics like built into science on such a deep level and such a material level, you know, that just speaks to how intelligence is situated in the body and the relation of the body to the world. So I love that phrase, you know, making sense. And it has to be part of the method. I mean, there's the method and then there's the graph, but those things to me are so kind of, you know, integrated. And as an artist who's interested in science, yeah, I also go straight to the graphs, right?
I have never heard someone describe science as art, and I love that you just described it that way. It does make me think about something which I feel like art, there's more of an opportunity to change it to what you want it to be. And that in science, we think we're not changing it. We're making careful observations and showing what's there. But of course, that brings up this fact that how do you know, like Ellen said, if you can't see the methods, that it wasn't just made up to look the way you want it to, consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously. Does anyone want to add something? Yeah, Jay.
So there's a long debate in the history of science and the philosophy of science over the role of aesthetics in how we make inferences from data. So kind of the most famous is Occam's razor. So prefer the simpler explanation to the more complicated one. If you think about it in terms of something like curve fitting, right? You prefer straight lines to curvy lines and so on. And there's a question as to why do we have that preference? Is that because it's getting at the truth of the relationships between things, or is it's just easier for us to manage, or we just find it more attractive, right? And so what Brian's keying into, I think, is something that we philosophers have worried a lot about, which is what's the nature of the simplicity we're talking about, and why do scientists value it as much as they do? Because it starts to look pretty aesthetic when you kind of peer under the hood.
I love this. I love this conversation. This is awesome. Does anyone have something to add on this topic?
Could I just, yeah, I have a couple of thoughts, really sprouting from Ellen's comments. I was so grateful for those. It's interesting to me that, you know, in these figures, we're distilling a lot of complexity into a message that we can wrap our brains around, right? Because I think in truth, the world is so complex, it's hard to make sense of. And so it's simplifying, but the beauty is in the details. It's in the methods, right? The necessarily, if we're going to, you know, extract meaningful information, those details are critical. So it's some kind of balance of being able to engage with the details to be able to critically consume this information. in a way that's meaningful. So yeah, thank you. This is so much fun. I love talking with you all about this.
So I'm going to go to another topic. One of the things that the author identifies is a number of different contradictions that exist in modern science, including he talks about this sort of idea of the really glamorous scientific lab and all the shiny, bright equipment, and then the reality of a lot of labs, which is nothing like that, right? He talks about the contrast of needing to be objective, but also being a human being and the subjectivity of that, and just these many differences in science. And he also talks about how the public usually sees the top 1% of all of this, right? The public's idea of science is really not really what real science is about. So I guess my question is about going back to the use of scientist as an insult, right? Oh, he's going to listen to the scientists, as if that's a terrible thing. Is there some fairness in that? Like, is it fair to think of scientists as not wholesome?
I do think it is important to recognize that contradiction of objectivity and subjectivity in science, because they absolutely exist in tandem. And I think this speaks directly back to how Brian was picturing, or was saying that science is an art, because there is so much creativity that goes into hypothesis testing. The method might be objective, but the questions that you decide to ask are all at the subjectivity of the decision making of the scientist, and how you set up your test. There has to be creativity there. All the questions that people are answering today, they're not easy questions, and so you need to be creative in order to figure out what is the best way to test them.
So should those scientists be trusted? And what,
I do think it goes back to, it's not just one scientist you're trusting. There are many scientists that, are talking and communicating and critiquing and rejecting bad work. So I think that you have to accept that there is going to be scientists who set out to prove their own hypothesis, whether you're in the social sciences or natural sciences. But you have a community of learners there that are kind of going to give you feedback on whether or not those answers and that method is good.
There's something really, I think, kind of profound about the incentive structure of science, that it can be highly competitive, as competitive as any enterprise. It's important to get your work cited. You're working against other labs in real time, but science is also incredibly cooperative, right? Your work depends crucially on all sorts of laboratories and research institutions and other scientists. And one of the remarkable things about science is it combines these really subjective elements about competition and self-interest into a structure where, as Ellen put it, bad ideas are getting weeded out. And so I think one of the things that makes science so unusual is the way it's balanced these various things to produce knowledge. I mean, the sort of metaphor of the knowledge machine, I don't know if I want to call it a machine, but science produces remarkably reliable knowledge through all sorts of really strange and interesting accidents. But I think that incentive structure is pretty profound to its success.
At the same time, there are real criticisms, I think, of science and the scientific structure. There is a power hierarchy in science in terms of who gets their work published or is listened to more in the field. There are deep racial inequities in science and gender inequities in science. And these are real problems that the field needs to be grappling with. And I think maybe is starting to. Does anyone have anything they want to add on this topic of scientists as people and whether or not they should be trusted?
I'll just add that I feel like the system inherently as designed is robust, at least has the potential to be robust. And in that the peer review process is continuous. And I think in the long view, bad science, meaning misinterpretations of data, will be weeded out. I tend to be an optimist, I'll say, but I do think there are intrinsic, robust structures to the process. I will also add that in this moment of big data, like there's actually a transition happening where it's pretty easy to publish, manuscripts or that are centered on lots of data that can be overwhelming for any reviewer to make sense of. And the systems are still being built for accountability with data processing. And that's critical for us to be able to critically evaluate the products of these, big data analyses.
Greta, can you take a second and explain what you mean by big data?
Yeah, so for example, in my field of biology, we're now able to sequence entire genomes from thousands of organisms, and those databases are really big. So you'll have billions of nucleotide sequence data, and a lot of the conclusions coming from analyses are through algorithms that search through those big data sets and look for patterns, and then make conclusions based on patterns. And so a lot of details about how those searches are done, how the data are processed and cleaned and sorted through, are often very opaque and could make big differences into the interpretations that come from those data. So our ability to produce data, I think, is exceeding right now our capacity to metabolize it and turn it into meaningful reflections of the realities we're trying to better understand.
And I think that also speaks to this idea of needing ways to visualize those large, huge data sets and understand what they mean. And sometimes demonstrating that visually can make that possible in ways that words couldn't as easily.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's right.
So we're talking about big data, but the author talks about this progressive narrowing of questions over time. And this iron rule, the need for empirical evidence and a small, narrow question sort of drive science toward this, he says, a degree of single-mindedness that is quite inhuman, that some scientists follow, right? So is this continuing? Is this narrowing continuing? Is there a slow evolution of scientific process to even smaller and smaller questions? Is that a necessary evolution? Is it making science better? Is it making science worse, or both? I wonder if anyone has thoughts about that and the size of the questions we ask and how that's changed over time.
So to some extent, it's understandably a natural progression to ask smaller and smaller questions. As we kind of build this world of knowledge, some big questions do get answered, and then we want to refine them and see how they work into different contexts. So it's a natural progression. But I do think that there's a threat to that. And I see this especially in the social sciences. So I do policy analysis. And the world of policy analysis is very obsessed with randomized controlled trials. So using experimental methods to randomize policy and see what happens, so that you can get a real answer of what is the effect of policies. And we see this, for example, in kind of studies of police reform. There's randomly assigning body cameras, randomly assigning where police patrols are located at different times of day. But then there's also this big critique that these are really small policy changes, and you can't randomly assign transformative change. And so those bigger policy issues are sometimes ignored because they're harder to study, and they're certainly harder to study experimentally. So I see that critique of kind of asking too small of questions come up in my field a lot.
In the field of biological imaging, which is my field, there's a sort of march toward better and better microscopes that can see smaller and smaller things. And this is a result of just technology developing. We had high resolution microscopes, and now we have super resolution microscopes that can see things even smaller. And so there's something about a natural progression just in terms of technology to be able to see more and more, which might force you to ask smaller and smaller questions about what smaller things do, literally. Does anyone else have thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I might jump in on that one. To a certain extent, like bringing it back to the technology, that makes sense to me. And I use a lot of technology and coding and programming in my work. And it strikes me how you talk about it and a lot of the critique, of big data right now, to some extent, you find what you're looking for in the data, right? And there's that predisposition of data to do a certain thing, kind of comes from the apparatus that we build around it. Like if you're sampling the world that is complex and multivariate, and you're putting it into categories as we have to do on various levels, whether that's species classification or whether that's just literally like sampling audio, into frequency. You are categorizing the world, right? And that does exclude certain kinds of possibilities, right? And when you program for things like this is what this made me think of. Like in programming, you're always borrowing libraries from other people. Rather than rewrite code from first principles, you're like, okay, someone already made that wheel, so I'm just going to grab that. I'm going to put this here, and put it all together to solve what I think is my particular problem. But you end up with this kind of Frankenstein apparatus that has all kinds of histories in it that maybe I'm unaware of, and that are leading me to particular conclusions or in certain directions, that is the result of the intersubjective project. So there's something of deep value to that, but maybe it also precludes other insights and other happy accidents or the big changes, like Ellen was saying. And in art, or sometimes in my practice, sometimes it's like, well, let's just build things the hard way. Let's reproduce the wheel. And see what happens. And it probably isn't going to work as well, but maybe there's another opportunity to come up with things. There's actually an artist I know who is a woman of color, Latina, who's gone back following her interest in plants, and is reproducing some of Darwin's experiments with observing plants, right? These are things that are like are very established already in the scientific literature, but what does it mean for someone like her in 2020 to be reproducing those things with like a slightly different perspective or a different eye to it, and try to recreate that knowledge? Maybe there will be things that come out of that that reveal a hidden assumption or something that was elided that ends up becoming significant. So yeah, that's my association from the combination of those comments from you all.
I wonder, I have a question that was brought up here. So when I got into political science, when I first started my PhD, I wrote in my cover letter to my PhD university that I was really interested in this research question, only to find out when I got there that was not a research question that political scientists actually asked. And that if you look at in political science literature, there are certain topics that are really, really well covered, and other topics that it seems like are almost unexplored, and that there's some sort of kind of path dependency in the type of questions that we ask. Do you guys find that in your fields as well?
Yeah, I'll definitely confirm that. I mean, I kind of think of it as like we shine the light on particular things, and then it becomes popular and multiple people come to it and then have a real frenzy and advance that, where there's a whole world out there doesn't have the light shining on it. And if you just think about the complexity of biology, there's so much to explore that certainly there are major areas that, people just aren't thinking about because they're not thinking outside of the box, or we haven't yet discovered the animal that lives on the bottom of the ocean that holds a bunch of secrets that can change our worldviews. But absolutely, and it's very easy to become kind of canalized on some thought path. That's the thing that's getting funded. That's the thing that's got a lot of momentum at scientific meetings. And I think some of the best scientists are those that take their own path and follow their own creative thought. If you can gain traction and get some money so you can actually do the work, that's the hard part.
Yeah, the funding agencies play a large role in controlling what gets done. And I think it's the giant squid at the bottom of the ocean that holds all those secrets. Some of this conversation is reminding me, Jay, of something you brought up before about observation and how science isn't just sort of creating these controlled environments where you collect data, but it's also just about observing and observing things you wouldn't necessarily think about as science. Would you mind explaining your thoughts on that and what we had talked about?
Sure. One of the crucial elements of the New Yorker piece and the book that it's sort of referencing is this notion of the ironclad rule, that science progresses by narrowing questions, but also getting more and more empirical evidence. That's the thing that sort of you, as scientists, always have to use as a touchstone. And one of the things that really struck me thinking about that is it strikes me as both overgeneral and too narrow. Right? It's overgeneral in the sense that Brian, in his art practice, uses reams of data and observation in order to do the work he does. So is what I mean. He may be totally cool with calling what he does science, right? But it raises the question: is that science? And then if I look at so much work that's being done on COVID-19, so if you think about all those epidemiological modelers who sit around and write tons of code in order to simulate all sorts of how possibly scenarios, they seem to be moving away from observation into simulations. Now, hopefully they come back to the real world, but the point is that sometimes you have to leave observation to do science. And a friend of mine coined a phrase that I think is pretty apt at this moment, is that we live in a day of what we might call fast science. Policy needs scientists to give them answers to hard questions, but when in real time, it's really hard to do the kind of careful detective work that's needed to answer those policy questions with accuracy and reliability. So sometimes you really need to let those modelers just go do their thing and come back. But if you need them to come back in a week, it's just a lot of pressure on scientists. And just to add one more wrinkle to it, I think one of the reasons why President Trump can be insulting with the term scientist is we're putting expectations on scientists to do the careful detective work so fast that they can build up policy advice that kind of weathers all comers. And I just think that's unrealistic. So all that's just to say, I think that the idea that, scientists always attend to observations is true, but I think it's overly simple. Sometimes you got to leave it, and lots of folks are paying attention to observation who aren't scientists.
Okay, so what I wanted to do now in the conversation is just open it up for additional points that any of you wanted to bring up, things that really struck you about the article or struck you about our conversation, or new directions that you'd like to go with these four or five minds collected here.
I think Jay's point about are scientists being critiqued because they're moving too fast is a really interesting one to scrutinize, because I think an alternative hypothesis is that science is being critiqued because it's not inclusive enough, because such a great percentage of our population doesn't have the training to fully follow everything, all the knowledge that we're being produced. And I think that it's really interesting in politics how we're seeing kind of a education divide in partisanship these days, where we are seeing kind of individuals with a greater higher education leaning more towards the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. And for that reason, then it seems no surprise that we're getting voices in the Republican Party starting, or at least the president, starting to criticize scientists, because maybe science isn't being inclusive enough. Maybe it's not doing a good enough job communicating its method, its results, so that it is believed by a greater mass of people.
Especially as the questions and the data become narrower and narrower. One of the examples the author brings up is quantum theory and how no one really understands it. And so it's difficult to communicate that to the public or to convince the value of that field when it's so hard to understand. We need to do a better job of explaining our stuff, right?
I maybe have a riff on that, or a question. I mean, it's quantum theory, right? It's a theory. And there's something great about that, I think, in science, that it is about incompleteness, right? There's always some threshold of knowledge that hasn't been discovered yet, or, things are not set in stone. And that's the beauty of the process. But maybe there's a little bit of a mismatch there with I guess coming back to aesthetics, with this idea of science as like this shiny modernist project, that aspires to solve all the problems, in this kind of deterministic way, so that it's advertised as a fact generator, and then it's being called upon to produce facts and knowledge that can be acted on instantly. And I find that it's because it's been presented in the wrong way. That really the value of it is the muck and the subjectivity and the theory and the incompleteness. And if that was what what we thought about when we thought about science, and not the clean lab, maybe we would have a different orientation. Maybe that would feel more accessible or fundamentally humanist in a certain way, and we wouldn't have this feeling of that maybe some of the public has, of feeling alienated from this apparatus that is producing facts, or not, or inconveniently not doing them, and there's some kind of a passive aggression in that in that relationship.
Do any of you have examples of success stories of either in the last 6 months or at any time where you've sort of seen that done well? You've either done it yourself or you've noticed others who are able to get across points well, visualizations that you've seen work well, just to try and bring some optimism in to the discussion.
I think so my partner works in science education, and one of the things that's really interesting to me is the role of citizen science in kind of what's happening now. If we want more and more data on any number of problems, from the environmental to anything else, I'm sort of interested in environmental issues, but it's interesting how more and more scientists are recruiting ordinary citizens to help them collect that data. And using all sorts of interesting bits of technology, from various apps and so on, to help scientists do the work they need to do. People who are interested in biodiversity conservation are underfunded and understaffed, and so they need people to help them to collect data on all sorts of things that matters to those people too, because these are problems that face their communities. You can see this in the context of climate change and other stuff too. So I think there's ways that we can kind of not make the public feel disenfranchised by science, but actually make them willing and interested participants who care about the results, because they're partly helping do the science.
I'll just carry on that thread a little bit, Jay. One of the things that I have seen in my field of biodiversity is, partly as a consequence of COVID, is an increase in activity on iNaturalist as a platform for documenting the presence of species. And it's fun, it's engaging, and it's actually generating some data that can help us understand ranges of species, for example. But this whole conversation makes me think of the PR problem of science, and I think this has to do with equity and the reality that academia has been built in this culture by largely white men, and we all sort of try to figure out how to navigate through it by taking on that culture. And it is pretty separatist from so much of our society. And it also, I think, reflects kind of an arrogance, whereas the reality is we know so little. And if we could restore some sense of reverence and humility to the way we approach science, to the reality that we know so little, and reflect that back, and like using citizen or community science as a way to say, hey, help us make sense of this complexity. It's critically important to all of us that we understand it better. And you all can help, like, shifting the perspective from scholars as knowing all the answers to scholars that are working really hard to better understand, and we can do it collectively and as a community-centered enterprise.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that the more voices that are participating in science, the better. And this is whether it's natural science, social science, art and science, anything. When you have a diversity of voices, you ask more interesting questions, you figure out more interesting answers. It is an all-around positive thing for science to be more inclusive.
Yeah, and I want to point out the obvious right here, which is that while we have a diversity of academic voices in this group, we don't have racial diversity in this group, and we have a narrow view that would be richer if we had voices of color, BIPOC voices in this conversation, which is something we weren't able to do for today, but I do want to point that out.
One other just quick thought on that. John Stuart Mill wrote a famous book called On Liberty, and he argues that the more diverse opinions and voices you have in inquiry, the more likely the truth will emerge, right? Because different perspectives bring critical resources that you lack if everyone is homogenous in any dimension. And so I think diversity is not only good for moral reasons, but it's epistemologically good. We're much more likely to succeed and understand the kind of complexity that Greta was getting at when you bring more people into that inquiry. So it's all sorts of good reasons for that to be the case.
It also speaks to objectivity. So I've been talking to my students about how if scientists were truly objective, you would have a diversity of opinions, creating the questions, asking the questions, and collecting the data. But historically, science was really set up by white men, and that's not objective, right? That's totally subjective. And so it comes into play even with how the science is done.
I'd like to just dovetail on that back to the data issue. So when I read this article, I'm very much of a data-driven person. I find data very comforting. I really like to create it. And when I think about a situation where science wasn't always necessarily centered on a data-generating model, and now like the real currency is well-collected data. And as we discussed before, we're kind of in a problem of having too much data. But the article also points out that one of the byproducts of all this is you get this data bycatch, if you will. Like we have lots of data. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily answer the question that it was intended to answer. But if we curate it well and we make it available to everybody, then together we can start to make sense of things. And a beautiful thing right now is open, easy access to major amounts of data, so people can do this work sitting in their living room with a computer, right? So it's a time when access to the ability, to the enterprise of doing science has never been easier in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I agree. I'm also a data-driven political scientist, and it is amazing that the online repositories that exist today and the transparency by which academics are doing their research is incredible. It's just kind of growing by leaps and bounds every single year. And I think it gives us a greater ability to talk across disciplines because you have these kind of now central online repositories where everyone can access it, no matter what field you're at. It's hopefully free. Hopefully you can analyze it from like an open source language so that we are breaking down some barriers, which is great.
And that also leads to inclusivity as well, because groups in labs with less funding who maybe can't have those big powered equipment to get the data can still at least analyze that data and ask questions wherever they are and whatever situation they're in. Yeah, so I'd just like to thank you all so much. Good luck in your own ventures with data, whether that's acquiring it or observing it, or borrowing it, or seeing it in the news. Thank you all and best wishes. Let me close by thanking everyone again for your time and energy. I know that everyone is very busy. I know that there's a lot going on outside of this conversation. And these are unprecedented times, and it's a hard time. And let's hope that somehow science has the ability to help propel us forward into a better place moving forward. So thank you again.